I stumbled onto the roof, drunk and wild, when my stepdad Kane, a washed-up rocker, caught me mid-dance with a flashlight glaring in my face. I ripped off my top, screaming at him to join me, and he lunged, grabbing me hard. We spun, the roof groaned, and something twisted between us. You won't believe where this mess took us next. I climbed onto the roof of our house in Texas after sneaking tequila from the party down the street, restless from the same old nights and desperate to feel something louder than the quiet life Mom built with Kane after he quit the road. The shingles scraped my knees as I stood, swaying to a beat in my head, when Kane, my stepdad, a 58-year-old ex-rocker who traded stages for oil-stained coveralls, hauled himself up through the attic window, his flashlight beam slicing through the humid dark and landing square on my face. I squinted, yelling at him to join me since he used to thrash guitars for screaming crowds, not just fix transmissions in a shop that smelled like grease and regret, and in a blur, I yanked my top off, tossing it toward the gutter. Not because I was drunk, but because I wanted him to see me as more than the kid he ignored. He cursed, dropping the flashlight, and it clattered down the slope, spinning light across the yard below where Mom's car sat cold after her shift ended hours ago, while he lunged forward, grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise, shouting that I'd fall and wake the whole damn neighborhood. I twisted, laughing, telling him he'd lost his edge, that the guy who smashed amps wouldn't care about a little noise, but a shingle cracked under my foot, sliding loose, and we stumbled together, his hands catching my waist as the roof groaned like it might give way and send us crashing into the flower beds 10 feet down. He didn't let go right away, his grip steadying me, and I felt his breath hot against my shoulder, the night pressing in, thick with sweat and something sharper that wasn't there when he'd grumbled about my music blasting through the house last week. A dog barked down the street, sharp and sudden, snapping me out of the haze, and I shoved at his chest, daring him to push back, but he stepped away, dragging a hand through his graying hair, muttering about how I was trouble he didn't need, though his eyes flicked over me like he wasn't sure he meant it. I bent down, snagging the flashlight, and shone it at him, watching him flinch, his jaw tight, and I asked why he even bothered climbing up if he was just gonna play the responsible dad now, when I knew he'd stayed out here longer than he had to. He didn't answer, just kicked at the loose shingle, sending it skittering off the edge, and I heard it hit the ground below, a dull thud that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness while Mom slept inside. Clueless her husband was up here with me, fighting something he wouldn't name. Hey, viewers, ever wonder how far you'd go to feel alive? I muttered once, low enough he didn't catch it, picturing myself spilling this later on some anonymous page where no one would know I was chasing the ghost of his old life to escape mine. I flicked the light off, leaving us in the dark, and sat by the chimney, legs dangling, while he paced near the window, his boots scraping the roof, and I waited for him to climb down or drag me inside like he should have, but he didn't, just stood there, hands in his pockets, the air heavy with unsaid things. A car roared past on the highway nearby, headlights briefly lighting his face, and I saw him clench his fists, like he was remembering nights he'd never told me about, nights I wanted to pull out of him, piece by piece, until he couldn't hide behind the mechanic he'd become. A week after the roof, I slipped into the garage late one afternoon, drawn by the twang of Kane's old guitar as he sat on a stool, hunched over it, tweaking the strings with a focus I hadn't seen since he'd dragged me off the shingles that night. I grabbed a pair of drumsticks from a cardboard box in the corner, the kind he must have used back when he played dives across the state, and started tapping on a metal toolbox, the sharp clangs bouncing off the concrete walls until he snapped his head up, glaring at me like I'd crossed some line he hadn't drawn yet. I kept going, daring him to say something, and instead of telling me to get out, he slammed his hand on the guitar, the strings buzzing loud, and yelled that I had no business touching his stuff, his voice rougher than the engine he'd been fixing all day. I dropped the sticks, stepping closer, telling him he didn't own the garage or the past he kept buried in here under piles of tools and faded band flyers tacked to the corkboard above the workbench, and he stood up fast, knocking the stool back, his face red like he hadn't been this mad since Mom caught him sneaking smokes last year. He pointed at the door, saying I should go before he lost it, but I didn't budge, asking why he bothered playing if he was so scared of who he used to be, and that hit something, because he grabbed the guitar neck like he might smash it, then stopped, breathing hard. His eyes locked on mine. The air smelled like oil and dust, and I could hear Mom's car pulling into the driveway outside, her shift ending early for once, though she'd never come out here to check on us. He set the guitar down, slow, like it weighed more than it should, and I picked up a crumpled flyer from the floor. Some gig in Lubbock from '89, asking if he missed the chaos. The nights he didn't have to hide behind a wrench and a wife who didn't get it. His jaw tightened, and he said he didn't need chaos anymore, but his hands shook as he shoved them in his pockets, and I saw the lie in how he wouldn't look away, like he wanted me to keep pushing until one of us broke. I tossed the flyer back on the bench, telling him he could have fooled me up on that roof, and he stepped forward, close enough I could feel the heat off him, saying I didn't know what I was digging into, his voice low, clipped, like he was warning me and begging me to stop all at once. The garage door rattled as a gust blew through, and I heard Mom's keys jingle in the house, her footsteps faint on the kitchen tile, but out here, it was just us, the amp humming faintly from when he'd plugged in earlier, waiting for a note he wouldn't play. I leaned against the workbench, folding my arms, asking what he'd do if she walked in right now, saw him like this, and he flinched, glancing at the door, then back at me, saying she trusted him to keep things steady, not to let some kid tear it apart. I smirked, telling him I wasn't a kid, and he didn't argue, just stood there, the silence stretching tight, until I grabbed the sticks again, banging once, hard, on the toolbox, and he snatched them from my hands, throwing them across the room, the clatter loud enough to make me jump. He turned away, kicking a tire stacked in the corner, and I watched him wrestle with something I couldn't see, maybe the guy he'd been before Mom, before me, and I wondered if I'd pushed too far or not far enough. Mom called his name from inside, faint through the walls, and he muttered he had to go, but he didn't move right away, his back to me, the guitar sitting there like a challenge neither of us could answer yet. 3 weeks after the garage clash, I couldn't sleep one night, tossing in bed while the clock glowed 1 a.m., so I texted Kane to drive me to a 24-hour diner off the highway, knowing he'd be up tinkering in the shop and wouldn't say no to getting out of the house. He pulled up in his truck 10 minutes later, headlights dim as I slipped out the front door, careful not to wake Mom, who'd left her shoes by the couch after a late shift and wouldn't stir until her alarm screamed at dawn. I climbed in, the cab smelling like leather and motor oil, and we drove in silence, the radio off, past gas stations and dark fields until we reached the diner, its neon sign buzzing red against the black Texas sky, promising coffee and pie to truckers and stragglers like us. We grabbed a booth by the window, the vinyl seats cracked and sticky, and I ordered fries while Kane got black coffee, the waitress scribbling our order before shuffling off, leaving us with a jukebox whining some old Waylon Jennings tune in the corner. I asked him about the worst gig he ever played, figuring he'd dodge it after snapping at me in the garage, but he leaned back, saying he'd once botched a set in Fort Worth when his singer passed out mid-song, and I laughed, picturing him young and reckless, not the guy Mom leaned on to pay the mortgage. He grinned, but it faded when a guy at the counter turned, staring at Kane like he knew him, and I caught Kane's hand tighten around his mug, his knuckles pale, like he'd seen a ghost from his old life. The guy, rough-looking with a leather jacket and gray ponytail, walked over, calling Kane by his stage name from the '80s, asking if he was still shredding or if he'd sold out to the suburbs, and I watched Kane force a smile, saying he'd hung up the guitar years ago to fix cars and keep things quiet. I kicked him under the table, telling the guy Kane could still outplay anyone, and the stranger laughed, saying he'd seen Kane's band in Austin once, back when they burned brighter than the bar's stage lights, before clapping Kane's shoulder and heading out. Kane stared at his coffee, silent, and I asked why he let that guy think he'd given up, when I knew he'd been strumming alone just days ago, chasing something he wouldn't admit to me or himself. Mom had no idea we were here, probably dreaming while her phone sat on silent, and I wondered what she'd say if she saw us now, me pushing Kane to dig up his past while some drifter reminded him who he used to be. He shifted, his leg brushing the table's edge, and I leaned forward, my hands on the sticky surface, saying he didn't have to play the good husband all the time, not with me, and his eyes met mine, sharp, like I'd hit a nerve he'd been hiding since the roof. The jukebox cut to a louder song, and I tapped my fingers to it, waiting for him to snap like he did in the garage, but he just said I didn't get it, that some things weren't worth dragging back up, his voice low enough I had to strain to hear over the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The waitress dropped off my fries, and I pushed the plate toward him, telling him to eat something before he turned into one of those grumpy old men who only drank coffee, and he snorted, grabbing a fry, but his hand lingered near mine, not touching. Just close enough I felt the air shift. A truck's horn blared outside, pulling us both back, and he checked his watch, muttering we should head home before Mom noticed the truck gone, though we both knew she wouldn't. We paid and left, the night still dark, and I climbed into the cab, feeling his glance as he started the engine, the diner's glow fading behind us while something heavier settled in its place. A month after the diner run-in, I dragged a blanket out to the backyard one night and told Kane to light the fire pit, figuring he owed me something after clamming up about that guy who'd recognized him, while Mom was inside, passed out on the couch with the TV blaring after a double shift left her too wiped to care what we were up to. He hauled logs from the shed, stacking them in the pit, and struck a match, the flames jumping up fast as I settled on the blanket, watching him stand there, hands on his hips, the orange glow catching the lines on his face while crickets chirped loud across the Texas dusk. I told him to sit, saying he looked ridiculous hovering like some yard work dad, and he dropped down beside me, closer than I expected, muttering that he hadn't done this since his band days, when they'd burn whatever they could find after a gig went south. I speared a marshmallow on a stick, holding it over the fire, and asked him about the guy from the diner, pushing to see if he'd crack open that part of himself he kept locked away, but he shrugged, saying it was just some roadie who didn't matter, though his voice tightened like he was dodging more than he let on. The fire snapped, sending sparks up, and I shifted, telling him I'd found an old cassette in the garage, some demo he'd made, and played it on Mom's ancient stereo, wondering why he'd buried it under junk instead of showing it off. He grabbed a stick, jabbing it into the flames, and said he didn't need tapes to remind him of nights he'd rather forget, but I saw his hand pause, like he could still hear the chords if he let himself listen. Mom's phone rang inside, shrill through the open window, and I froze, thinking she'd wake up and stumble out here, but it cut to voicemail, some nurse friend checking in, and Kane didn't even glance toward the house, just kept staring at the fire, the heat rolling off it in waves that made my skin prickle. I pulled my marshmallow back, biting into it, and told him he couldn't hide forever, not when I'd seen him play in the garage, not when that guy knew him better than Mom ever would, and he turned, fast, saying I didn't know what I was asking for, his eyes hard, like I'd stepped too close to something he'd kill to keep buried. I wiped sticky fingers on the blanket, saying maybe I did, maybe I wanted to hear it all of the fights, the crowds, the mess, and he tossed his stick into the pit, the flames flaring up, his jaw clenched tight enough I thought he'd walk off right then. The neighbor's porch light flicked on, a shadow moving behind the fence, and I lowered my voice, asking if he ever thought about running back to that life, leaving the shop and the house and us, and he said he'd tried once, years ago, but Mom pulled him back, though he didn't sound grateful, just tired. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, telling him he didn't seem like the guy who'd stay for anyone, not even her, and he looked at me, long and steady, the firelight flickering in his eyes, and said sometimes you don't get a choice, his words hanging there like smoke I couldn't wave away. A log collapsed, the crack loud enough to make me jump, and he reached to steady the pile, his arm brushing mine, lingering just long enough that I felt it, though he pulled back when the neighbor's dog started barking, breaking whatever had started to build. He stood, dusting off his jeans, saying we should douse it before the whole yard caught, but I stayed put, watching him grab the hose, the water hissing as it hit the flames, and I wondered if he'd ever tell me the truth or just keep running from it. Mom's TV droned on inside, a laugh track cutting through the night, and I wrapped the blanket around me, knowing she'd never guess what we'd almost set out here, or what I'd almost made him admit. 2 months after the fire pit night, I convinced Kane to drive me to a flea market an hour outside town one sticky summer Saturday, saying I needed a lamp and some shelves to shake up my room before I lost my mind in this house. He didn't argue, just grabbed his truck keys while Mom was still in bed, sleeping off a graveyard shift that left her out cold until noon, and we hit the road, the cab windows down, hot wind whipping through as the radio crackled with a station he didn't bother switching, probably too lost in his own head to care about the noise. I rummaged through my backpack for a water bottle, telling him about a song I'd found on that cassette, some raw track he'd never finished, and he gripped the wheel tighter, saying he didn't remember writing it, though his voice sounded like he was lying to both of us. The market was a sprawl of tents and tables, people shouting over each other for deals on dented pots and sun-bleached records, and I darted between stalls, grabbing a chipped mirror while Kane followed, hauling a wooden chair I'd haggled for, his shirt sticking to his back from the heat as he muttered about the junk I picked. We loaded the truck by mid-afternoon, but instead of heading straight home, he veered off the highway onto a dirt road, tires kicking up dust as he said he needed air and a break from the asphalt. pulling over near a dry creek bed where the scrub stretched out flat under a sky too big for anywhere else. I climbed onto the tailgate, swinging my legs, and he leaned against it, arms crossed, telling me he'd crashed here once with his band after a gig in San Antonio, too broke to find a motel, and I asked if he missed that freedom. The kind mom's schedules and paychecks couldn't touch. He kicked at the dirt, saying freedom didn't pay bills, but his eyes flicked to the horizon like he could still see the van parked there, and I slid closer, asking what he'd do if he could go back, if he'd drag me along to see it, half joking until he didn't laugh. A pickup roared past on the highway, horn blaring, and he flinched, turning to me, saying I wouldn't last a week out there, his tone sharp, like he was testing me or warning me off, and I snapped back that he didn't know what I could handle, not after the roof, not after the garage. He stepped closer, boots crunching gravel, and said I kept pulling at things he'd buried for a reason, his voice low, frayed, like he was mad I wouldn't let him forget, and I stood up on the tailgate, eye level with him, telling him maybe he needed someone to pull harder. The wind picked up, tugging at my hair, and I caught him staring, not at the road or the creek, but at me, his hands flexing like he might grab the tailgate or me, and I dared him to say it, whatever he'd been choking on since that guy at the diner saw through him. He didn't, just shook his head, saying I was trouble he couldn't afford, and I laughed, telling him he'd already bought it the night he climbed that roof, the words hanging there as a hawk screeched overhead, circling slow, like it knew something we didn't. Mom's shift would end soon, and she'd call if we weren't back, but out here, the phone signal was dead, and I wondered if he'd planned it that way, keeping us off the grid where she couldn't reach. He climbed into the cab, slamming the door, and I hopped down, dusting off my jeans, asking if he'd ever tell her about these detours, about me, and he started the engine, saying she didn't need to know what didn't hurt her, though his grip on the wheel said it already might. We drove back, dust trailing behind us, and I leaned against the window, watching him wrestle with the silence, knowing we'd left something out there by that creek he couldn't bury again. 6 months after the roof, Mom left for a nursing conference in Houston on a Friday, her suitcase by the door with a note for Kane saying she trusted him to keep an eye on me, and I found him in the guest room that evening, wrestling with a busted dresser drawer he'd promised to fix weeks ago. I walked in, tossing my phone on the bed, telling him he'd need help or he'd be at it all night, and he grunted, handing me a screwdriver from the toolbox, his fingers brushing mine as he kept working. The room quiet except for the creak of wood and the faint hum of cicadas outside the open window in the thick Texas dusk. He'd left his shop early, still in his work shirt, and I sat on the bed's edge, watching him yank at the drawer, sweat beading on his neck, wondering if Mom's note had him on edge or if it was me standing there, pushing into his space again. He got the drawer free, setting it on the floor, and I handed him a rag, asking why he didn't just trash it and buy a new one, but he wiped his hands, saying he didn't quit on things that could be saved, his voice rough, like he meant more than furniture. And I shifted closer, my knee nudging the toolbox between us. The bed creaked under me, and he glanced over, not moving away, telling me to hold the dresser steady while he lined up a screw, and I leaned in, my arm brushing his as I gripped the edge, feeling the heat off him cut through the AC's chill, the air tightening like it had by the creek, only now there was no road noise to break it. He drove the screw in, slow, his breathing louder than the tool, and I asked if he'd ever fixed anything for his band back in the day, pushing him again, and he stopped, looking at me, saying he'd patched more than I'd ever know, his eyes dark, steady, like he was daring me to keep going. I stood, stepping around the toolbox, and he straightened up, the rag slipping from his hand to the floor, and I told him he couldn't patch everything, not the stuff I'd seen in him since that first night, my voice low as I moved closer, the bed behind me, the dresser beside us, boxing us in. He didn't back off, just stood there, his chest rising fast, and I reached past him for the screwdriver, my shoulder grazing his arm, lingering as I set it down, feeling him tense, his hands flexing at his sides like he might grab something, me, the dresser, anything, to stop whatever was rolling toward us. The window blinds rattled in a gust, and I turned, my hair brushing his sleeve, and he shifted. Close enough now I could hear every breath, every hitch, the space between us shrinking until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for one of us to move. He lifted a hand, hovering near my arm, not touching, just hanging there, and I froze, my pulse hammering, telling him he didn't have to play it safe, not here, not now, with Mom gone and her note sitting useless downstairs, and his jaw clenched, his fingers curling back, though he didn't step away, his eyes locked on mine, burning with something he'd buried too long. I edged closer, my hip brushing the bed, his shirt sleeve skimming my wrist, and he exhaled hard, his hand dropping but staying near, the heat between us coiling tighter, every second stretching, teetering, like we'd tip over the edge if either of us twitched. Then Mom's photo on the dresser caught my eye, of her and Kane, younger, smiling, and it slammed me back, my stomach twisting, and I stumbled away, grabbing my phone, saying I couldn't, my voice cracking as I bolted for the door. He called after me, hoarse, but I hid the stairs, snatched my keys, and ran to my car, peeling out into the night, leaving him standing there, the house shrinking in my rearview as I swore I'd never post this, never let it breathe beyond that room.